So now we have an emergence of large language models. And today we're starting to see the speed of adoption. How we communicate, how we research, how we improve our productivity has actually transformed society. So LLMs offer remarkable capabilities when it comes to natural language and understanding and the generation of more accurate and human-like language. But they also introduce some new challenges and risks when it comes to the practice of cybersecurity and its agency, its adjacency into data privacy. Data breaches and attacks have been really prevalent in narrow AI, but with the increased vulnerabilities introduced by LLMs, we're starting to see more sophisticated phishing attacks, manipulation of online content, and exploitation of privacy controls. Welcome everyone to Tech Uncensored. My name is Hessie Jones. Today we're talking about cybersecurity in the era of large language models. So here's a little bit of a wrinkle. It happened a couple of days ago. April 22nd, the Biden administration signed Section 702 of FISA, which is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, into law. That essentially reauthorizes the government to spy on US citizens without a warrant. So I interviewed Christine Bannon, who is a US public policy manager at Proton. And she said this: LLMs will be used by governments to sort through large data sets for intelligence, making it easier to conduct mass surveillance. So today, we're honored to welcome Sima Fancy to be with us today. She has an expertise in data privacy and the intersection with cybersecurity and AI. We'll dive into many of these vulnerabilities when it comes to LLMs, and we'll actually address the new law and how it legally undermines individuals' data privacy rights as well as their civil liberties. And what are the implications of all of this for emerging tech companies? So a little bit about Sima. She has 2 decades of professional experience in chemical engineering, privacy engineering, law, data privacy, and security. She's a speaker. She's a mentor and an active member and volunteer with the IAPP, All Tech is Human, leading Cyber Ladies, Women in AI Ethics, and the Governing Council for the U of T Faculty of Engineering. Welcome, Sima.
Thank you, Hessie. Happy to be here.
Great, thank you. This is going to be an amazing discussion. So let's start with your journey. First as an engineer and how you eventually moved towards data privacy.
Yeah, so my journey I started with doing degrees in biochemistry and then chemical engineering from the University of Toronto. Set off to the traditional engineering routes in my career path. Worked as a chemical engineer in an environmental consulting firm doing environmental site audits of different chemical plants across Canada. Working with lawyers along the way, actually, for the transactions that were happening of these plants. And along the way of in between doing lab work and presenting our results to lawyers and potential purchasers of these properties, I fell in love with law and decided to pursue a little bit of law. I'm not a lawyer, but did work in a couple of boutique litigation firms and became a scientific legal advisor and picked up a lot of those skills along the way. And did that for quite some time. Had a startup of my own where I worked with lawyers in essentially storytelling their stories by way of medical illustrations in court, and went all the way up to Supreme Court of Canada with the lawyers who retained my services. And then went back into engineering again and ran a manufacturing facility here in Northern Ontario of pressure-sensitive labels, working with machinery and running businesses, and learned all that. And still, I wasn't fully satisfied. I had all this plethora of skill sets, and I thought, somehow I need to be able to bring them all together and put them to really good use, and be constantly on a path of learning in perpetuity. And that's when I discovered data privacy and cybersecurity. And it wasn't by accident. It was by design. I was looking for a landing professional space for myself where I could use all my skills, and that's exactly what I found. And got a bunch of certifications done, including a privacy engineering certification at Carnegie Mellon University and from a few other places. The journey began with the public sector, working for the Ministry of Health, going to private sector, to Twitter, learned about social engineering and how that works. And right now back in the health tech space again. So really, really happy about my how I
That's
came to where I
amazing.
am today.
That is so amazing. I find, especially in this space, when it comes to, let's say, responsible tech, you either fall into it, or you actually make your way towards it. And I think at the time that data privacy and even responsible tech, it wasn't vogue. I think people just decided to do the right thing, and they were trying to find ways to do the right thing when it wasn't popular. So
Exactly. And for scientists like myself, a tech geek like myself, and also a philosopher of sorts who wants to do the right thing, how do you do the right thing? By putting all of this together. And data privacy, protection of people's data is the right thing to do. And I love it.
that's great. That's great. Well, thank you for joining us today. I'm gonna throw a couple of stats at you when it comes to security breaches, just to give context into how serious this problem is. So between 2022 and 2023, there was a 20% increase in the number of data breaches. The number of publicly reported data compromises increased 78% year over year from 22 to 23. And the average cost of a data breach reached an all-time high last year of 4.45 million, and that was a 15% increase from 3 years ago. This is an interesting one. 98% of organizations have at least one third-party vendor that has suffered a data breach. And globally, there were twice the number of victims in 2023 compared to 2022. So what do you think the underlying causes of these trends are, especially when it comes to the number of data breaches and the level of harm that they've done?
It's the greed for data and whatever means to be able to get to collecting the stocking up of the data that big orgs want, right? That the fangs of the world want, and with that come nefarious acts. With that come irresponsible acts, right? With that come deployment of tech without doing enough soul searching and enough scientific reasoning. Which says, for example, OpenAI, it was released way too early, right? And sometimes a lot of these technology pieces are released early by design to be able to collect as much data as possible. The transaction is you can download it for free, but it's not really free because you're going to be putting in your data, which they need to run their models. Because without a corpus of data of a magnitude that is in thousands or hundreds and thousands of petabytes, these LLMs can't run. They cannot function.
So it's almost by design when you say like it was released far too early, but if it wasn't released, then it wouldn't be accurate. So it's almost like a chicken and egg thing.
Well,
That's
no, they could have purchased the data lawfully and trained it as such, but then perhaps they would have the counter arguments that you don't have the wide variety of data that
right,
you train on and
right.
whatnot, right? But the responsible thing to do would be to wait. Gemini wasn't out yet, and it was ready. There were many other tools that were ready at the time, but they weren't released yet for that particular reason because they were going through sandboxing, they were going through validation testing, verification testing, right? So I think a lot of this leads to it, and a lot of times it's not done purposefully by companies. I think there's a lot of excitement, there's a lot of need for it, there's a lot of want. Everyone's waiting for the next twinkling toy to come out.
Yes.
So, there's a race for it, which can cause inadvertent harm. And it's just like, okay, let's just release it and see what happens. See what sticks on the wall, so to speak,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. It seems almost counterintuitive in a lot of ways when for technology. I guess from a process perspective, QA, ensures that the technology or the product is working before it's released into the ether. But when it comes to AI, it almost turns that whole process into its head. It's released into beta and then perpetual beta until and at the same time, the harms get perpetuated at the
Yeah,
same.
and don't forget a lot of these tools are not stable, right? And what that means is that they are the developers are iteratively learning, they're fine tuning as time goes on. So that means that what's coming in is not necessarily going to give you the correct information of the output that you want, right? So we're still in learning stage, and yet it's live on the worldwide forum.
Okay, so let's talk about LLMs. So when they indiscriminately scrape information, it can expose things like your credentials, your PII, or any kind of confidential information. So from your perspective, are we much more vulnerable today? Because it seems like we're on the defensive and trying to mitigate a lot of this stuff that's happening.
The public at large is vulnerable, no doubt. More vulnerable than the past. Well, not much to compare with. This is unprecedented, right? We're in the fifth industrial revolution. AI has been around for a while, but Gen AI hasn't. So as we release these tools out in the public and not educate the public on how to use them, yes, the vulnerability level is super high. People are entering in their clinical notes and records and asking ChatGPT to summarize, or whatever tool they're using, right? Not realizing that once you put your personal information in, it's gone into the ether and is going to be used to train models, right? And that your information, if it's not protected, redacted, pseudonymized, anonymized, whatnot, will be able to cause the output results to be able to re-identify you. Hence, there goes your privacy, right? So from that perspective, yeah, the vulnerability is at an all-time high, and that's not just doesn't just go at a personal level, at a corporate level too. If you introduce all these tools to your employees and not train them how to use it, not train them in the area of prompt engineering, the vulnerability is super high. And for corporations, the risk is even higher because they risk to lose trust. They risk data breaches. Remember, as these tools are coming out, not only are we at the receiving end, benefiting from it, but at the other end, where you've got nefarious actors, they're using them to fine-tune their ransomware attacks, their phishing attacks, and whatnot, and becoming more and more sophisticated. Hence, you're seeing the attacks go up and the cost to remediate them go up.
Okay, so let's dive into that. So can you mentioned a few there. Can you talk a little bit more in detail about the rise of some of these attacks, and what are they?
Yeah, a rise of a lot of these attacks are the most common ones are from phishing and malware attacks, right? The phishing one being the easiest, where this email comes in, it looks exactly like your bank, the colors are right, the logos are right, and it says, oh, there was money that was by mistake withdrawn, and click here and you can deposit back in. And of course, when it comes to something like that, your dopamine level goes high, and you're like, yep, I'm going to do it. Click, click. Before you know it, you've been attacked, right? So that's the most common methodology, both from a commercial and a personal level. And as why the systems are failing so much is because a lot of the systems out there are legacy systems with faulty APIs, leaky APIs. Companies are still moving to the cloud, or they've got a hybrid system, or they've got just on-prem systems, which actually right now seem to be a little bit safer than some of the cloud computing systems. Also, the other thing is, when startups are starting, they are not calculating in forking in costs for security and for privacy concerns, and that's a huge mistake, because by the time you realize it and you do it, it's kind of too late, so to speak. If you look at privacy by design principle number one, be proactive, not reactive, because reactive is not the way to be able to backtrack and try to fix your system from the get-go. In your software development life cycle, put in these principles from the minute you start developing your software, from the minute you deploy it and data gets ingested. Those are some of the measures of preventing these attacks, but these attacks are super sophisticated. I've just given you some of the simple ones, but they go through the roof in sophistication, to the point that they can bring banks and hospitals down, which is what's happening right now. If you look all across North America in the healthcare landscape, you've got hospital up to hospital coming down on their knees. And the protocol is, don't give in to these the attackers, but that means a lot of data is on the dark web being sold for pennies on the dollar.
Yeah. So I remember the attack that happened with, I think it was Indigo, and the employee data was compromised, and unfortunately, they couldn't do anything with it. They gave in to the attackers, as you have said that they shouldn't.
They
And
shouldn't, yeah.
the only thing that they could do was tell their employees, go back to your bank, try to change your credentials and to limit the effects of them actually coming in, because the employees had to give up obviously their bank account information, because that's how they get paid. So from that perspective, it almost seemed like large corporations are handcuffed and don't really understand how they can mitigate it. So imagine that from the perspective of a small startup that's just starting to collect data, and they may think that they're immune to it because no one is going to try to attack them.
Yeah, and that is such a naive way of thinking. What these LLMs have done is essentially increase the landscape of attack, of the attack landscape. It's increased it so wide. There's so many ways for nefarious actors to get in, and they do get in, and they linger, and they watch you function and your employees function within your servers, within your systems, and then they find that back door at the right moment, at the right time, could be middle of the night, and then boom, they get in, and then that's it. The access is there. And a lot of times corporations don't even know that that's happened until it's too late. So what I'm saying is, why allow that to happen? Why allow them to find backdoors that you didn't think of? Put in these measures ahead of time, carve money out if you're a startup in your funding ahead of time, and make this a priority, because all of this would be for naught then at the end of the day. You could lose your entire business if you don't to put measures in place, which brings us to regulations. It's regulations that are becoming robust around the world that will bring you down, right? We know that in EU, we know in certain parts of the States, the punitive damages are deep, and they are cutting in deep. Canada's catching up. We're getting there. And with AI acts becoming as robust as well, you can't afford to be laissez-faire about this.
Okay, so let's talk about another law, and I alluded to it in the beginning. So this was the Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And so just a bit of background for our listeners. This law was actually established in 1978 to spy on foreign individuals. This is the US government. But after 9/11, the rules changed that allow the broad sweeping of US citizens' information without a warrant. Now, they call this incidental collection. They said, well, if it comes in there, we're still going to allow it, right?
Yeah.
So some key dates. 2013, NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden exposed this prison program, and information began to surface about big tech, Google, Facebook at the time, giving the government unfettered access to people's data. 7 years
Right.
later, it was ruled unlawful, and this bulk collection of the U.S. citizens' emails, their mobile communications, their phone records violated the Constitution. So since then, they've actually added provisions to increase the oversight and minimize the incidental collecting of people's information. But ultimately, 2 days ago, all three governments rejected it, and 702 in Section 702 without amendment was actually now put into law. So now we have these LLMs. They're far more powerful than what we considered, let's say, 8 years ago when the AI hype was here. They have increasing context and understanding of people's behavior and their intentions. So from your perspective, what do you think the implications are for companies that actually collect the data and create these models more often?
Yeah, with laws like this passing, and I understand it's been renewed for another 2 years to be able to collect data and force companies to hand over that data. The implications are huge. So if the governments, federal governments, want to come and collect data on a span of population, these companies are mandated by law to hand it over. which is surveillance it's just been taken at another level, right? In government-related surveillance, the implications are scary for regular folks, day-to-day folks, and it's all justified under the guise of, well, it's state protection, right? We need to be able to spy on our citizens living abroad, on any foreign state actors that may threaten us. Sure, at the face value of it, it does look all right. It looks like, okay, we need to do this, but it just opens up doors wide for abuse at a larger scale, right? With a justifiable tool. So it's unfortunate.
What do you think that means for, let's say, companies that collect information about their customers, but they do not want to hand over the information to the government once they've requested it? Like, what can they do from what are they doing from a technological perspective to try to protect the data privacy of
I
those?
don't know what they can do, because this FISA law is nationwide sweeping, and it compels companies to hand it over. There is no a door to get out of it. If you are going to be collecting data, you by law are mandated to hand over the data sets if requested by the federal government.
So in companies like Signal or Proton, they've basically said we can't access your data. It's end-to-end encryption, and it only allows you as a user to have access to the data that you create. Is that a way to absolve your responsibility from a government mandate if you technologically do not have the capability of actually accessing individual user information?
Yeah, I would think so. I think that's a really good point you raise. There's things called data vaults out there, where if you do allow your customer to put the data in there and you are just working off of the metadata, those vaults are locked and encrypted and only the customer themselves can access them, then yes, blockchain technology is another one, right? Where you've got the key to open and close, and unless you're asked personally, which the federal government won't come do because FISA doesn't apply to them. That is one way to protect them, but that requires a lot more measures, less money making abilities as well, right? Because now you've really constrained your data pool and you're not able to use as much of it. But sure, definitely those are two good use cases.
Okay. So you mentioned earlier about startups, I wouldn't say it's difficult for them, but I think they're not mindful at their early stages of the things that they need to do to actually protect the information that they're collecting.
Is it because of lack of money issue, you think, or is it just not
I
being
think
aware?
in the early stages, startups care about developing a product that meets the market need. So they're so used to building a tool that has solutions around it that the thought of the data collection and what they're collecting probably doesn't come in until much later.
Right.
So I think en masse, they don't think about that. So, but you say that data privacy security should not be left as an afterthought. So, what can they do in the beginning to shield themselves from the threat of any kind of cyber attack and minimize the damage from them?
Yeah, there are a lot of out-of-the-box tools available out there in the market to allow them to put in security measures within the cloud space. So assume we're working with a scenario where all the data that they're collecting and their computing is happening within a cloud structure of their choice, whether it's private or public. There are a lot of out-of-the-box security tools that they can buy and deploy within their cloud to manage those data sets, and to be able to scrape their own cloud, classify them, categorize them, bucket them up such that they can protect them, right? And then monitor their clouds constantly, to see if there are any infractions happening, any kind of loopholes, any kind of openings that are within their cloud structure. But these tools are not cheap, right? And they are expensive, and they can be deployed in the beginning, right as you're bringing data in, whether it's unstructured, structured. And the other thing, it's really important for them to know that if they're going to be dealing with huge amounts of data, they need to know where it is, right? There are a lot of big data companies that have said, we don't know where our data is sitting. We don't know which data centers it's in. It's just flying all over the world. That alone is a huge risk. The other thing startups can do is make sure that encryption's in place both for data at rest and data in transit. A lot of times they only look after encrypting data at rest and they think, okay, we're done. Well, no, a lot of the infractions that happen is when your data is traveling from data center to data center, from desktop to data center and whatnot, right? You've got to make sure the encryption's happening there as well. So there's a lot available. We're sitting in a really good spot in time of technological evolution where we can say we've got a lot of things available at our leisure to be able to use. Not to use them is highly, highly irresponsible. And the cost of those tools are coming down, but you've got to, as your funding is coming in, you've got to be able to set some money aside to be mindful of doing that.
Yes.
Just like for your data storage costs, you're mindful. Similarly, your privacy and security tooling, you've got to set money aside and purchase those tools and get them embedded right away so that you're going to be compliant with the laws, because these laws are coming down hard and fast. They're robust. They have huge punitive making and order making powers, and they can shut you down. The Googles and the Metas of the world are able to take the hit, but a small startup, they're going to be wiped out.
Can we talk a little bit about some of those costs in the past, like that Google, that Meta have actually had to pay because they weren't compliant? And let's be clear, before the these privacy laws actually came to be, a lot of these guys were already flying under the radar because they were doing stuff that didn't have a law attached to it, so they could do it, but they continued to do it even after the law actually came to be. So can you remember some of the infractions that Google or Meta had to absorb because of this?
There've been so many, I've lost track of them actually.
Yeah.
A lot of them they've appealed. Now remember, Google's and Metas of the world have a lot of money, so they can hire lawyers to do appeals and counter appeals and whatnot. Right? At the end of the day, they do end up paying, but they pay a lot lower costs of it. And in the beginning of time, before regulations came into place, they were getting away with a lot of it. Even the beginning of when GDPR came in, they didn't take it very seriously and were able to get away with it. But now we're at a stage in the regulation ecosystem and the iterative evolution of it that country after country, there's over 130 countries that have put in robust privacy and cybersecurity laws that have order making powers, are no longer going to accept being under the radar. They are aware, they're technologically aware, their legislation are being constantly amended and updated to keep up with technologies. So it's going to be a lot harder for companies to get away with it, even the large ones. But the little guys, they're going to be wiped out completely.
I know. I think that's the unfortunate fallback of legislation, because I mean, if you're a small guy trying to do the right thing, but you may not necessarily have either the tools or the financial resources to try to put everything in place, and you inadvertently do something that is not compliant, then you're right, you could be shut down, and it gives more power to those that remain within that space, right?
But there are other things that some small startups can do. They can practice data minimization. They can practice collecting data for the purpose that the data was collected. They can put in robust consent management measures in place, and put audit logging in place, and be able to manage those logs and see who's got access controls in place, right? There are these other mechanisms and practices that are fairly healthy within data ecosystems that they can put in place that can help them get there if they can't afford the big out-of-the-box tools. Or they can even purchase these tools, but smaller features of them. And then eventually, as their funds grow, they can enlarge the features and purchase more of them. But these practices are there that they can implement.
Exactly. And I think so the companies out there like Signal and Proton, they're there to provide a service. They don't use any of their users' data for anything, even from a dashboard perspective. The minute you start creating these advanced services for your customers, then you need the client data, and then that becomes gold to you, and then you can monetize it, and then you create this downstream harm.
But even then, there are certain out-of-the-box tooling companies out there that actually allow you, the customer, to go in the safe space that create for you within your cloud, where you can manage the data with the tools that you buy from them. So they say, we'll support you, we'll give you the tools. Here is your space, here's your enclave. You go manage it. We won't have access to it, but we will support you as you need us. So there is that design as well.
Yeah, and I think as we start to get more into giving people control over their information and the ability to delete if they need to delete everything, we have to remove the ability to create redundancy in our systems, and
But that ability to delete is not in the hands of the consumer, right? What they have available to them is the tool called Forget Me. The ability for us to ask you to forget us, for ask you to delete our information. But how do you delete data that you don't have a handle on? How do you delete data that's not been classified and categorized as such, whether it's PII, PHI, financial data, right? And how do you delete data that's in a mixture of systems, whether it's multi-cloud, hybrid one? And what about the fact that if there's data duplication? You've got data sitting on your developer's laptop, and you've got data sitting in different cloud structures, right? How do you effectively delete data then and comply with the law?
And I think that's the issue, right? So the law sits here, but the reality sits here. So how can you enforce a law that doesn't allow the systems to effectively comply?
Yeah, and the GDPR, I mean, these laws are so robust, you can't even back up data as an organization that collects data without consent of your customer, or without letting them know that that's happening, right? Because if they have mechanisms where they've got the keys to their data and it's been locked, you can't just go in and take it and back it up for them. So those are good, healthy practices. Whether they're happening at large or not is questionable. Right, but they're all there. And there are standards out there like NIST and ISOs that help you get there. Right, even if you can't afford the big shiny tools, there are practices that you can implement within your startup that are good.
Well, thank you, Sima. I could talk to you all day. This is one of my favorite topics, but that's all we have for today, unfortunately. So today's progress, as we noted, is not without consequence. And I think individuals need to be a lot more cautious, more informed, while organizations need to be more vigilant as AI continues to expand. So thank you
absolutely
so much for joining us.
Thank you.
No problem. So Tech Uncensored is powered by Altitude Accelerator. We're produced by Blue Maxon Transistor Radio. My name is Hessie Jones. And until next time, have fun and stay safe.